Oh, you'll notice uh, MLS. What's the first thing you see? Fake landlord scam. You know, we've had a lot of discussion on the attorney panel last week about fraudulent land deals. Well, this landlord scam was very, very prevalent during the distressed property days when homes were not occupied and there'd be a for sale sign out front. And the scammers would go around the back and change the locks to the back door and then put an ad in for a rental. And they would take the deposit, send the keys, and say, and people would say, well, what about the for sale sign? And oh, don't worry about that. That's not going to happen. So they would actually get thousands of dollars in money from prospective tenants who were getting a much below market deal on a home, a single family home. A lot of them in the estates, some in Pine Ridge. So this is nothing more than the sign of the times. And we've always had a problem with Zillow, where somebody could advertise a property one digit less than the address or one digit different and get inquiries. And Zillow's since cracked down on you being able to put your own listings in. So I think some of that's gone away, but you used to be able to put your own rental listing in. And they didn't validate the address, so you change the address by one digit, and boom, you had a rental property. So obviously, with times getting tougher and rentals becoming more scarce and more expensive, really, we don't, as agents in our office, don't get too involved with rentals, but Bill Archer does, and I'm sure that these are the kind of things that let your it's a buyer beware kind of thing, but there's nothing really governing all this. And that's why we had so many scam rentals during the distressed property days. So just saying, just keep your eyes peeled, and somebody asks you whether or not this is a real deal, check it out. So one of the things that I'm going to start doing next Tuesday or tomorrow is I'm going to start back with my market watch. And if you take a look at the overall 7 days, take a look at what's happening. New listings are higher than they were before Ian. Sold's about the same. Pendings almost matching sold. So what does that tell you? It tells you there's still a lot of activity in the market. And those numbers went down into the 400s during a few weeks around Ian where it was a little scratchy. But now with the first part of November, I think we can go back and start taking a look at the overall market. But 733, 493 sold, 713 pendings, and look at the number of price decreases. Now, some of these price decreases because of the storm, possibly. Someone asked me this morning, how would I go find, blighted properties for an investor? And the answer is, you can look at price decreases. You can see where there's been significant decrease from where it was. You can look on here and see now there's a 9.9% price decrease on $100,000 in Fort Myers. But it doesn't say anything about, just says this is your chance to remodel and make a beautiful custom design home. Oh, this is a flood damaged condo. See that right there? So can you go in and look at, I don't really know how to do this, but you can go into the description for any MLS and you can search the property information section with a wildcard search. If you haven't ever done that, let's see if we can figure out a way to do that. So you go into a search. Residential cross property. You can go down and set up a special field. I've got a few here, but you can set up a special field called property information. And right here, and you can type in asterisk flood asterisk, and you can get a series of properties that have the word flood in their property information. Now, does that mean every one of these has flood damage? Probably not, but there's our same listing right there, right? This is a flood damage condo. So you can kind of use the MLS as a tool by searching the property information section to see if we search for Ian did damage the roof, flash siding, and the insurance adjuster will be here this week. So a lot of people are like, I don't want to fix this place up. I don't want to fool around. Cut the price. This happens to be a new listing, but with flood damage. So are there opportunities out there in the current marketplace for investors that are looking for to buy damaged properties? Yes, there are. There's a way to find it might be to look as a trigger into your dashboard and look at the price decreases. And take a look at the ones that have the most significant price decrease. There's 9.9 there, 14.67 in Naples Park. Chances are that might be some flood damage. This says not touched by the hurricane, but they went down $150,000. What do you think, Mark? Any reason for that? Just no activity at the higher price?
I was doing a little search.
They put it on November 3rd at $9.95 and lowered it on November 7th to $8.49. That's
Yeah,
kind of,
maybe something else sold in the area. I don't know. It's Naples Park.
Yep.
Yeah.
that's strange behavior. Unless they just were in the dark, but they were only shooting in the dark for 4 days.
Yeah, or maybe they got an insurance settlement or something and they don't need as much. You know, Jeff, what this makes me think of is that you could do a auto search or an automatic notification using the word asterisk flood asterisk.
Yep.
And get notified when something in the public information remarks comes up that has flood in it.
Or storm,
Hurricane.
water, not in a flood zone, but they lowered it quite a bit. 6%. Went on at 424.9, 5 days later, 399. That's interesting. Well, the point is that people are starting to ask me, I have an investor and they're interested in looking at damaged properties and maybe making an offer. So asterisk flood, you can search for more than one, but flood is a good one. Damaged is another one that you could search. But especially if you shrink the area down from all of Southwest Florida to your neighborhood and put a search in, as Mark is suggesting, the minute something pops up like that, they get insurance adjuster comes out, and all of a sudden now they've decided to list the property. But some of this is kind of strange behavior, unless, as Mark said, there was a closing right nearby. It's a fairly new house built in 2021. So interesting. Just showing you the wealth of information you have at your fingertips when you look at your MLS. The October numbers are in, albeit briefly, from InfoSparks, but we were looking this morning. I've been kind of endorsing the use of absorption versus a month's supply. But just take a look. This is all Naples area. We can change this to Collier. But this is October. You can start to see that the median price is jumping around a little bit, but still quite a bit down from the peak of 635 in May. low of 550 in July, 597, then back up to 570. So the median price is moving around a little bit, but if you draw a line, the overall trend is down. The other thing to kind of look at that we were talking about this morning is there's two ways to look at what's on hand. One of them is month supply, right? And it's based on sales, and it says that it's now 2.6 in Collier County. Okay, so the way we get that information is we divide total sales, we divide into homes for sale. So if you take those two numbers there, total sales in Collier 709 and homes for sale 2572. So if you divide that out, that tells you your month supply. So the other way to look at it that I kind of like is the absorption, which is the same data, but just stated differently. And that's the other way of looking at it. So that the other way to do it would be 702, 709, and divide that into 2572. Oops. 7. And that's giving you the absorption rate of 27.5%, or what is it, 1 in 5, roughly, slightly less than 1 in 5 probability that a home will sell in that neighborhood. So 702 sales, 2,572 properties on the market. So 28% of the time, 28% of the properties have a probability of selling in a month. So when we graph that, it looks a little differently when you're explaining it to a customer, because now they're looking at, okay, there's 10 homes on the market and only 2 have sold in the last 30 days. What's my absorption? 20%. What does that mean? That means 1 out of every 5 homes is expected to sell in the upcoming month at the rate of absorption. So I've been using those graphs from Trend Graphics to put them out with the monthly stats. And that might help you to talk a little bit more on a listing appointment with your seller than saying there's a 2.9 month supply. That's more of a generic, oh, okay, what does that mean? Well, 2.9 months supply is still a seller's market, right? It's less than 6 months. And so it's still a seller's market, but how does that translate to Mr. or Mrs. Seller? What is the chances of your house selling in the next month? 1 in 5. And that number was 1 in 1 or more than 1 in 1 back in the peak. So if you look at absorption, maybe that's a different way for you to explain to a seller what's going on with the market. But clearly, the shift has happened, and now we're starting to see a fairly level number of total properties for sale, and sales still coming way down from May, but ticking back up just a little bit in October over that's actually a decent uptick, 592 to 709, still less than August. So these numbers are good to share with your customers, because if they turn the news on, they're liable to get an entirely different impression from the news. So here's your median close price. Here's your average price. Average tends to bounce around a little bit more based on the mix of those 709 sales. The median was number 353. The average is all of them added together, an average. So the average price is going to fluctuate a little bit more, but you can see that the trend line is down significantly. So this is InfoSparks. You can, if you wanted to look at absorption of single family homes in Collier, and now you got a different equation. You've got 1647 for sale, and you got total sales of 344. So that's a different calculation, but still, you want to look at it on an absorption standpoint, it's 344 divided by 1647. That's just 21% absorption rate. So single family homes are not being as absorbed as fast as they were. And you can look at condos. Condos again, 925 homes for sale and total sales of 365. That's a little better. That's almost 40%. So it's important and you can go ahead if you want to look at a particular neighborhood, or you can compare two neighborhoods. Like I can add Lee County in here real quick. And you can start to take a look at the differences between the counties or neighborhoods or developments. I caution you that when you get the sample size real small, like you're going in a neighborhood, there's only a couple sales, the numbers can skew quite a bit. So you see that Lee did better, but still not as well as last month. Then you can start to see the absorption for all property types in Lee is 1,030 divided into let's see. That's 26%. So a little bit better absorption in Lee than in Collier. Everybody okay with all that? Do you think that's a good way of maybe talking to your customers on a listing appointment about how quickly they can expect their house to sell based on the total homes for sale and the total that are selling in a month?
Jeff, I
Yeah.
recognize you're not training on InfoSparks. Is the data only good for state of Florida, or is InfoSparks nationwide?
This particular version of InfoSparks is only good for Southwest Florida MLS data. I mean, that's the only data that's populated into it. I believe that InfoSparks is available. It's a showing time product, so I believe that they customize our reports and everything to Southwest Florida MLS data.
Hey, Jeff, do you know if, because I know I've asked for this, if they're considering even doing just lots? Because I know they have the single family and the condos, but there's no category for just lots.
Not in InfoSparks that I know
Okay.
of.
Yeah.
You have to go into, there is a stats package in Matrix. It's not delightful, but you can use the stats package in Matrix to do some lot and land stuff.
Yeah, I've seen that too. It's not as nice as InfoSparks.
That is good, but it still does have quite a few pieces of data you can get out of there. So,
Okay, thanks.
sure. Trend Graphics, I don't know what, I think Trend Graphics does lots. I'd have to go look at that. So, all right, well, the subject of today's conversation is compliance. And so I'm going to go ahead and change around here. So why do we have compliance? So that's why Broker Jeff has less hair than he did a few years ago when he joined in with Keller Williams. Just kidding. Let's talk a little bit about how compliance works in Command. I'm gonna have to get Command up here. Where am I? Command died. Okay, that's why it wasn't up there. All right, now we're good. So we actually have a class that we did last week, but there's a class and a cheat sheet on how to use command to get paid. And we're gonna start to do more of this teaching for newer agents. So when they finally get a contract and a check, they can monetize it. But overall, compliance has a number of different meanings. So the first thing that I think of when I think of compliance is I think of all the things that I need to do when I write a contract to make the contract whole for the customer. And I think of when we're looking into opportunities and compliance here in a few minutes, you'll see that we have certain required documents to support certain transactions. So if you are in you're selling a single family home in Naples Park, that's pretty much it. There's a sales listing contract of applicable, there's a sales contract, and unless there's some addendum to do with a property related condition or something like that, it's pretty simple. You got the sales contract, you have the MLS information if it's an MLS property, and you're pretty simple in terms of what documents are required. Now let's go to a bundled golf community that you have a condo inside a bundled golf community. So now you have the condo complex itself with its own governance and documents. Then you have it's sitting in a master HOA, where the master HOA might run the community and the gatehouse, the golf course if it's there. So there's a contribution from every door in the community toward the master association. And then inside of that might be a condominium complex that has all of the documentation and governance of the condominium. So you can get to where the number of documents required to be compliant is much more complicated. So we guide you through by taking a look at opportunities. So if you have not set up an opportunity, I'm looking at the people here, and pretty much everybody's done a lot of this already. But the key to do it is now you can do a new opportunity. They've enhanced this a little bit so that if you start an opportunity and you don't have the contact in yet, you can now add a contact on the fly, which is nice because you're starting out on your opportunity. Say, geez, I forgot to set up my contact. You can now do that on the fly. The other thing that you can do when you're setting up opportunities is tag them so that you can go back and look at various opportunities you've had. If you want to look at your referrals, things like that, you can do that using the tags. So when you get into each document, let's see if I pick one that All right, so when you come into your document there, it's going to ask you for the details, right? And you can edit the details by these little pencils up in the upper right corner. And you have to have certain things going on. So the general information on the opportunity requires that you have at least certain information, right? And that you have a contact. And always remember to set the opportunity phase to active. If you set the opportunity phase to active, then you could do what's called a submit to MC. And then that goes to the compliance a person, which is me, to review your documents for compliance. So that's where you edit that. One of the things that people call me about when you're getting ready to do your DA, you always have to have a property address in here. And it has to be recognized as an MLS property address or recognized somewhere in the KWLS multiple listing system. But you have to put a property in here if you have anything to do with the sale, the list or sale of a property. The system will allow you to leave it blank, but then when you go to put your offers and commissions in, it'll say no property. So try to make sure you spend a little bit of time on this page and put all the information in that you know of. Then we could go to documents. So you know that there's the first thing you're going to pick is a type. So you can put a residential in, or you can do a referral. Those are the types that are selected. And the minute you select residential, then the system will select the documents that are available. Now, if you have DocuSign or you have .loop, you can connect to a room in your DocuSign or a loop in .loop, and you can transfer the documents all together. And remember that if you're setting up an opportunity, always set the opportunity up first and then go set up the transaction, because otherwise your compliance and your documents in command will not link to your room. So always go contact opportunity, then create the transaction. If you go backwards, if you go just popping into DocuSign and set up a transaction ID, it will not communicate back to command. So you'll still have to download all the files from command and upload them in, or excuse me, from DocuSign and upload them into command. It's an extra step. It's not the end of the world, but it will save you quite a bit of time to already sync your documents between the two systems. All right. One of the things, and now this happens to be a buyer, so we have consultation, and in the consultation we have a few required documents. One of them is the affiliated business disclosure, right, which is in the contract library, but it's basically saying we have to tell the customer that we offer title insurance, that we offer mortgage services, that we offer various services. You don't have to use them, but we have to, by federal law, we have to disclose them. And that's where that required document comes in. Now, if it's an optional document, that means if it applies, you can put it in. A brokerage relationship disclosure form is not a required document because it's not required in Florida. So that's where we get into the various reasons why a document's required and why it's not. So the reason we have required documents is these records are saved for, I believe it's 7 years. So they can be, and we get a few a year where a court or a law firm will subpoena the documents and ask us to produce all of the documents that we have on file for the transaction. And that's why we have required documents. So y'all are welcome to ask any questions you want as we're going through this. A couple of other things that I see on this page. We go down to under contract, right? And then you'll see another list of required and optional documents. All right. So your affiliated business disclosure can be the same document as it was up above if you're dealing with a buyer. And so you can duplicate that document, or you can just copy it over from the other one, or you don't necessarily have to put anything into consultation as long as you have it in as a required document in the under contract folder. Okay. The rest of these things, if it's for some reason not an MLS transaction, or you sold it before you put it in MLS, all you have to do is come up here where it says add comment, and you can add, a comment in there that says, hey, this is a non-MLS sale. And then that just sticks in there so that we know not to look for a printout. The tax record is usually always there. And there's your affiliated business disclosure. So your sales contracts are optional Why? Because there may be more than one type. But I still get, because it says optional, I still get a lot of submittals where there's no sales contract. And when I message them back, it's like, well, it's not required. I said, well, one of the other is required. So be careful with that word optional. Usually there's a little note next to it. It says, things about the contract there. So your HOA disclosure is conditional if you're in a HOA. Your condominium documents are conditional. If there's FERPTA involved and foreign buyer. And the wire fraud notice is only required for FAR/BAR contracts, because in the NABOR contract, the wire fraud disclosure is right in the body of the contract, right above the signature page. So you don't have to worry about adding that. One of the things that I get a lot of questions on is, okay, so now I have my first escrow deposit and I upload that. And then I get a second escrow deposit and I'm like, oh, what do I do now? Well, the answer is don't go here and put it in a custom folder, because a custom folder I can see as a compliance person, but I can't do anything with it. I can't review it or approve it. So try not to use the custom folders. What you do is you come up here to these three little dots and you see where it says add document. You can add a document and you can make it the second escrow deposit. Or whatever name you want, but it's easy to add a form. And you can say it's a disclosure. You can put additional notes in there and put the source is my computer and drag it in there. That will create that other document. Why they hid that behind these three little dots, I don't know, but I would say a significant percentage of people are not aware of those three little dots. So if I've added any value to you today, it's those three little dots up at the upper right where you can go ahead up there and add a document. All right. So close is your closing statement. That closing statement needs to be not the closing disclosure that the buyer gets from their lender, but rather the actual closing statement from the closer. So try to put that in. That's the only way we can verify that commissions got paid and everything balanced in. So don't, you can upload whatever you want, but the closing statement needs to be the one that validates. Now, if you have let's see if I can find a better opportunity here. Oh, I was gonna say you can always put a offer and commission in. We'll do that in a couple seconds. I just wanted to see if I could find one with a DA already in it. Yay. Okay, so let's talk about offers and commissions and DAs. So you need a distribution authorization to be issued in advance of your closing, right? And that's issues is the RMCA goes through, sees that all of the contracts are approved, is ready to go, and we put in the payments to the market center, to the agent. This happened to be a referral. So this document is something you would send to the closing agent or attorney in advance of the closing. Try to get these things in and approved 5 or 6 days before your closing. And you can send this via email. You don't need to send both pages. That's our page on commissions. But send this first page, just download it. See the little download arrow there? That'll allow you to download it. And then you can send that off to the closing agent. However, remember, this is not automatic. You must retrieve the DA, send it to the closing agent. That's our closing agent's approval from the broker that this gentleman can collect that kind of money directly at closing and not have to wait for a check to come here and be parceled up and given to him. All right. So that's important to know that DA, once issued, will be placed right in here by the MCA. All right. So, and it won't automatically go to the closing agent. That has to be done by you. So that's another area that we see a lot of questions and concerns. I'm gonna admit yet. Someone asked about the Hurricane Ian disclosure. There is no Hurricane Ian disclosure that I know of in Farbar. I'm sure they'll come out with something, but they really never had a Hurricane Irma disclosure either. That's something peculiar to NABOR, and we don't advise that you mix the contracts. Because the terminology and defined terms and everything are different. All right. So here we have, we have a closing statement. This is what a closing statement looks like. This one happened to have a check and the actual closing statement. This is what's called an ALTA, American Land Title Association. They can come in different forms, but they actually have a seller and a buyer column showing how the money was dispersed and the fact that this commission was paid, and it's the same as is in the DA. So those are the kinds of things we look for to make sure that we have a complete record of the transaction. Again, if it's a required document, it's not going to get full approval until all of the documents are in there. And I might approve every document in there and say, okay, send me the second deposit and you're done. So you'll get a little note back in Kelly or to your email or however you have it set up that gives you from the compliance side a note that there might be something you need to do to finish your contract. Once you get those both approved and the DA in there, you're good to go. Send that page to the closer and you can get your check right away. Let's see, is there any other questions? So any questions on the process so far? Obviously, the important thing is that you upload the documents that are required, and you can do that at any time. You take a listing, you can set up an opportunity, upload all of the listing documents and submit to MC. And once you submit to MC, then it comes over to the compliance side. I review it. And once you get an approval like this and an offer and commission submitted, then you're golden, you get paid. So let's look at the offers and commissions, okay? So the first thing you're going to do is click on this offers and commissions button, right? And you're going to get a screen that looks like this. And it's going to ask you to add an offer, okay? And in the add an offer, I don't want to mess this transaction up. It's going to ask you for the buyer and seller information. It's going to ask you for the offer amount, how much was offered, how much was financed, what was the earnest money. It'll ask you for all that, right? And then it will ask you, let's see if we can do one real quick here. You always want to name it. We'll create the offer. We'll see that it asked us for a few pieces of information here. It wants to know the offer date and the close date and the address for the property, right? And it will generally bomb if you don't have the address. There we go. So now we want, go ahead on in the parties. It's gonna want the buyer's name, it's gonna want the seller's name. Not gonna check it. And then there's certain amounts of required information. It's gonna want the associate's name and their email address, right? And we're gonna get the terms. So it's gonna ask you how much cash, how much financing, what percentage of the down payment there was, and if there's any seller credits. Oh, correct. So there's gonna have all that information in there, the percentage that, you don't know the deposit percentage, in which case it's 10%, you can always just put the down payment down, which would maybe is $5,000. So that's gonna figure that out. This is gonna give you an opportunity, not required, but to compare the pros and cons of the two offers. And then you're gonna save it. So now we got two offers here. We're gonna remove that one because we don't need it. So let's take a look at what happens when we get the offer in. We're gonna view the commission. All right. So the commission information is in here and it's required to edit. You can edit it if you want to edit it, and it will allow you to put the contract date in. And once the contract date, it wants the agent information. It's going to calculate your royalty and your contribution for you. Right? And in this particular case, we had a referral fee. And we added it in down at the bottom. I don't think this is the right DA. Anyhow, just you get the gist of, once you put all this in, okay, you're going to submit it. And that's how you're going to get your DA issued. The combination of your forms approved for compliance and your direct authorization is what completes the transaction for you and gets you paid. So if you haven't done this yet, I think a lot of people think it's a lot of extra work. It's a kind of an effort to combine getting all the required documents in and combining that with the compensation, the offer and the compensation portion, and saving it all as one transaction. Are there any questions, or am I preaching to the choir here?
No, good.
All right. So, let's talk a little bit about compliance when it comes to contracts themselves, okay? I'm gonna bring up the NABOR contract and talk a few things that I see when coming from compliance. Let me see what I've got here. I'll get rid of that. And that. And whoops. I don't want that one. I want neighbor contract. All right, let's review a sales contract. The right other one. By the way, for your information, your broker Jeff was chair of the Legal Resources Committee this year. And every year for the last two revisions, we've managed to come out with them in February, which is right in the middle of the season. And it's a little bit uncomfortable for people to stop and take training So a goal this year for the 2-year revisions was to have it ready. So we'll be starting to teach the new contract. We're starting with the brokers tomorrow, and beginning on December 1st, we're going to be teaching the new contract, the changes. So you'll have 5 or 6 opportunities to attend in person or on Zoom. And you'll be able to go through the changes with what we call red lines. So you can see wherever in the contract is changed. Also on December 1st, all of the new contracts will be released in the library. So there won't be a lag between when we train on the new contract and when we release it. So this was my objective for the year. And my last meeting is December 2nd, and mission accomplished. So you'll have a brand new contract with many really good changes in it available for use starting December 1st. All right, let's talk a little bit about the contract and some of the areas that I see where you can get yourself into some compliance issues. So the first one obviously is starting with 8 and 9, 13 and 14 that deal with the real property and the personal property that the buyer, because the buyer that writes the contract, they must focus on doing this properly, or you'll run into some issues. And again, you can see a lot of drama and a lot of strain on a customer relationship when they go in for the walkthrough and the 60-inch plasma over the fireplace is all there is a bracket and a wire hanging there. Oh, wait a minute, where's that TV? Well, you'll notice that the standard boilerplate says television brackets, excluding televisions on line 8. Oops. There's no substitute for taking an inventory. If everything that's conveying is covered by this paragraph, great. But if there's other items that your buyer is expecting to have and the seller is expecting to transfer, the only way to do it properly is by a written or possibly a photo inventory that's signed off by both parties. So you want to talk about a huge compliance issue. You go into the day of closing and there's things missing. The nice Samsung washer dryer has been swapped out for a Sears scratch and dent. You know, things like that if you don't identify them and you don't have records of them, then they can create problems for you. And the day before closing, is not the time you want to tackle these problems. So always take an inventory. And in many cases, if you have a cracked listing agent like Mark Benson, there'll be attached to the listing will be a complete photo or written inventory of what's going to convey. And you need to download that and have your buyer review it and sign it. And the seller will sign it. And now you have an agreement. Sans that, putting the words in there, turnkey, per MLS, as shown, none of those things add up to anything. And if you don't properly have a written inventory or a photo inventory or both, then you can get yourself into a situation where there's drama. And normally when there's drama, who is the center of the transaction? Well, it's the realtor. So who will be blamed for problems with items missing, not there, that the buyer was expecting? Who's going to be the culprit? Whether or not you had anything to do with it, you are the culprit. So make sure if there's a number one compliance issue in this contract, is to get a list of the inventory and personal property that are going to convey at the time of sale and have everybody sign off on it. It could be one item or it could be 10 pages, but especially if there's financing involved, where the lender doesn't like to see a lot of things in here because they're lending on the real property, not on the personal property and other trinkets that are not listed in this paragraph. So if you have financing and you don't want that information to go to the lender, then you do a separate personal property inventory, Same thing, it's written or photo or both. And it's signed off on, and a separate document is drawn up by the closing attorney or agent that conveys the property above and beyond what's listed in the contract. So that's when you have, and when people say, oh, well, I'll mention the inventory, but I'll leave that page out when I send it to the lender. That's not compliant either, because now you're not telling the lender the total contract, and you're not sending them all of the parts of the contract, and that can constitute some mortgage fraud. So you don't want to do that either. So if it's financing and you've got items that are above and beyond what's on this list, you really need to have a list or photos or both and signed off on by all parties. And the handling of it, if there's financing, can be done separately, but perfectly legitimately without mentioning these items on the contract. Any questions or comments there?
No.
If you want to see a really good listing, look at one of Mark's listings. He gets it. He says, I don't want to get in an argument over some porch furniture that didn't get listed on the inventory, and now the buyer's there waiting for the porch furniture and it's not there. Right, Mark? Oh, you're muted. All right, so the other issue that you can run into is the legal description of the property is the trump over the physical address. There have been cases where the post office address does not match the legal description because of a corner lot or an entry point. So it can be the property can be on a side street by legal description, but have a post office address that's on a main street or on a side street. So make sure that you have the complete legal description. If it won't fit in here, attach it separately. There's a few meets and bounds and long legal descriptions out there, especially as you get out to the east into the estates. But if it's doesn't contain on here, make sure you add it, because that's what trumps everything else when you go for the sale. I have had people sign a contract for the wrong lot. The legal description didn't match the address, and sure enough, they were trying to buy at the wrong lot. That was embarrassing. So again, here is another area of compliance. If you have parking space A101 and A102, and you put 2 in there, and the parking spaces get switched or changed, you don't have a leg to stand on. This is especially important in towers where the parking assignments they're made to suit the individual owners as they buy the property, and they can be shifted. So you don't want to put 2 in there and find out that your buyer, who's expecting the 2 parking spaces right next to the elevator, is all of a sudden over on the North 40 on the other side because the neighbors decided they would switch, and you didn't have the proper nomenclature in there to enforce that. Same with garages, cabanas, especially with boat slips. I've seen the wrong boat slip or a boat slip of 1. What does that mean? Very difficult to enforce that. So make sure you put the right ID in there. Good practice in 30 to 32 is to have the deposit wired within 3 days, because if you're in a weekend of negotiations and it accompanies the offer, from your initial licensing, you have 1 business day to get it to your broker, and your broker has a total of 3, and we don't hold escrow as a brokerage, so it's got to go to the closing agent, who then has to deposit it. So I don't recommend that. I've seen people shorten the first deposit to 1 or 2 days, which is fine, because they don't want the buyer take the property off the market for 3 days and find out they're not going to buy it in the first place. But a company's offer is a little bit tough logistics, especially if your brokerage doesn't hold escrow. In the NABOR contract, it is always advantageous to split the deposits between line 29 and line 33. Why? Well, because the penalty for default in the NABOR contract is deposits made to date. So if you're doing things like mold testing, radon testing, things like that, and the testing comes back, much to the dissatisfaction of the buyer, and you have $5,000 in there rather than 50,000, it's a lot easier for the buyer to say, okay, I mean, I know this is not toxic mold, but I don't want any mold. Welcome to Florida, there's mold, but whatever, then the buyer does have the opportunity to forfeit that first deposit and walk away. In FAR/BAR, if you put 5,000 and 50,000, the seller's remedy is 55,000. In NABOR, the seller's remedy is 5,000. So the proceeds of the mortgage, again, from a compliance standpoint, the number that you put on that line is what you're protecting your buyer from if they can't borrow that money under the terms and conditions that are in page 2 here. Again, we talked a lot about period of offer and counteroffer. If you're not careful and you don't track this, it's easy to have a seller sign the contract after this period expires. Do we have a contract? No. If the buyer or seller got remorse and took this down to their friendly local attorney, and it was supposed to be signed on Saturday by 10 p.m. and you get it signed today, then the contract's expired, your offer's expired. So if you don't amend that or change it on the fly as you're making the change, you've got an expired offer, and it really is. I bet I see half a dozen of them every month. And I usually send a little love letter back saying, hey, if I were you, I would amend this contract to include the period of offer to be after the last signature and date. So be careful with that. It's like I say, I see 5 or 6 a month and they're like, oh, I didn't see that. Well, you could have a situation where one or the other parties gets remorse and walks away. Not a good idea. The only time of the essence date in the NABOR contract is closing date. What does time of the essence mean? Time of the essence means that if that date passes for any reason, but there's a default. If it's a date that the buyer had to perform, the buyer's in default. Same with the seller. In FAR/BAR, all periods are time of the essence. You miss a deposit by 1 day, you miss the inspection period by 1 day. Those are all time of the essence. In the NABOR contract, we've designed it to be a little more flexible. So the only time of the essence date is the closing date. So if you're not going to be able to close on that date, you need to get all parties to extend it, or there's a default. And if it's the seller that can't get their proceeds in on time, the buyer, then the buyer could lose their deposits. I get a lot of questions on this next sentence. You want to leave the dwelling on the property in broom clean condition and free of debris. So if you're at the walkthrough and you take a peek in the garage and it still looks like Hurricane Ian went through there, you have the right to say, I'm expecting this property by the closing date tomorrow or later today to be in broom clean condition and with no debris. So that's your standard. It doesn't mean that it was professionally cleaned by a cleaning company, although some people are willing to do that or willing to pay for that. But the point is that that's the standard for transferring property: broom clean condition and free of debris. So again, you can go cash and get a mortgage, but you're not protected by the financing contingency. Here's one that I see quite a bit lately. And if you look on line 61, and this is the audience participation part. If you look on line 61 and I put in, I want a conventional mortgage, and it wants to be a fixed rate, not exceeding blank per year, amortized terms, I put 30 in there and I'll apply like 5, and I'll waive the contingency in 45 days. What happens to this loan? Can I use my financing contingency to get out of this loan if I don't put anything in there and the rate comes in at 9.5%?
I would say no, you can't.
Correct. And what happens if you put in PREV? Prevailing. What's the prevailing rate for my credit score? You know, after the Fed just raised the rates, and now all of a sudden the lender says the best I can do for you is 8.5. And you didn't put anything in there, or you put in prevailing. Or FARBAR defaults it to prevailing based on the buyer's credit score. No matter what you've done, have you properly protected your buyer from a rate hike or a situation where because of their credit or their debt to income ratios, they can't qualify for the lowest rate? The answer to that question is no. If you didn't put anything in there, you're exposing your buyer to the inability to get out of the contract at a much higher rate than they wanted because you didn't put it in there. So that's a compliance mistake that you really always should have something there. If you put 8 in there, that's fine. If you put 7.5 in there, if you put 7, the sellers, when he looks at it, goes, well, wait a minute, there's no 7 rates anymore. So I'm gonna sign a contract that allows you to get out because there aren't any 7 rates or 6.5 rates. So you have to be a little careful with that. But to make sure you put a number in there, but always put something in there. Because you otherwise are exposing your customer to not be able to get out of a contract if the rate they get is very high. Line 65, possibly the most misunderstood paragraph in the whole neighbor contract. What does it mean? So in the neighbor contract, does the buyer have to waive their financing contingency? The answer is no. And for a long time, when we had 7 or 8 months of inventory, buyers were routinely advised not to waive their contingency, because what happens if you lose your job a week before it closes, or something happens to your health, or whatever reason, and you waive that financing contingency and you can't close, your deposit's on the line, all deposits at that point. So I think the important thing there is to realize that that date needs to be something realistic. If you're on the listing side, and I've seen contracts come in where 45 days blank is after the closing date. What does that mean? That means the buyer could waive their contingency on the day of the contract and be perfectly legitimate. I'm out. I'm to take my financing contingency and my deposit and move on. So make sure that that date makes sense with the lender. How quickly do you think you can get me a approved loan that I can hang my hat on? And with the seller to say, it's got to be a reasonable time before the closing date so that I can make certain that if I have to move or get a storage unit or whatever I have to do, I have to have time. So that is a very important date. And what happens if I don't waive the contingency on or before the contingency date? Either seller or buyer may terminate this contract at any time. So in the old days, when there was a lot of inventory out there, very few sellers would make the election to terminate because they're like, well, I got to start over, more showings, more contracts. I'll just tough it out, or at least for a while. So now there's still not much inventory. You know, the absorption's gone down a little bit. The total number of months supply has gone up a little bit. But that still doesn't mean that you aren't in a neighborhood with a desirable property where you don't get a lot of information from the buyer's agent or the buyer's lender, and you don't get a warm fuzzy feeling that at day 40 of 45 that the buyer is going to be able to get their loan to close. What can you do? You can send the buyer a letter on any time after the contingency expires and say, so sorry, I'm out, here's your money back, I'm going back on the market. So the seller termination in this market has been much more prevalent than at any time before. Well, here we come. A lot of compliance stuff in this contract. So here's another most misunderstood part of the contract. The intent of this all caps bold sentence is to say, hey, look, if there's a situation under the CF, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the creditor lender, where I'm fine, I've got a clear to close, I've done everything I can, but the lender can't deliver the package until after the closing date. So who's famous for this? A lot of the major lenders, they start working on your clear to close on the closing date. Is that your fault? No. Are you approved? Yes, but they don't have the package ready and may not for a day or two. This allows the buyer to extend up to 10 days, but two things have to happen. What's the third, fourth, and fifth word in this sentence? If buyer waives this contingency. So in order to invoke the 10-day extension rule, the buyer must waive their contingency that's defined up here in 65. So I know a lot of times when an agent will call me and say, hey, the buyer can't close tomorrow because they don't have their loan paperwork, and the cat ate the homework or whatever the excuse is. So they've told us they're going to extend up to 10 days. Okay, so the buyer has to waive the contingency and notify in writing the other side that we're going to exercise this date. And you certainly have the right to ask for some validity to all this. Go ahead, Mark.
Another good reason not to have same day closings. If your seller is depending on the proceeds from a finance deal, you might not want to schedule the same day closing.
Yeah, I've seen that happen, and it's extremely difficult because lenders can be delayed. A lot of the major lenders are often delayed just because they have more work than they can put out. So I would say that, you know, you want to make sure that your buyer, if they've got a clear to close, be prepared to waive the contingency and ask for up to 10-day delay. And if you're a seller and you're expecting that money and you get a legitimate 10-day delay by the buyer waiving their contingency and notifying you that they're going to be up to 10 days late because of the lender, that's going to put the buyer, the seller, in possible default on their contract because they can't close unless they have a similar paragraph in their contract. So if your seller says,
Might be beneficial to have some language that says if for any reason the seller's property does not close due to a financing contingency failure, that contract of the property that they're purchasing can also be extended so that they don't lose their deposit. But that would be something an attorney would have to draft, I think.
for sure, because it's a contingent on a condition that doesn't anything part of the contract they have with their buyer. You could get
In
into
today's market, most sellers will probably try to hold the deal together rather than having to put it back on the market. But if there's a deposit that they can grab, they may grab the deposit and go ahead and put it back on the market.
I'll teach you for a couple minutes. So anyhow, I think that's a great point. This is a extremely misunderstood section of the contract. I've had so many people say, well, I get an automatic 10-day extension. Nah, so. And it's just, if Mark says it impacts the seller on the other end, now you've got multiple drama going on. So again, be careful of that. Make sure that your buyer understands that if they're going to ask for 10 days, they have to waive their contingency, which makes their deposit firm. Get into a lot of discussions now on assessments because of the hurricane situation. In many cases, we're just now settling Irma assessments. It could get a little bit better because of the new legislation that was passed in May that says you only have 2 years to file a claim on a major hurricane. or storm event like that, you used to have 3. So a lot of these Irma claims, Irma was a 2017 storm. And this is 2022, and we're now just settling some of the insurance claims from Irma. So you have to be very careful with assessments in this environment, because in many cases, you're under contract and there's no damage to your unit. Maybe there's some minor damage to the community. There's no reason that you, from a damage standpoint, that you can't close, but you know for a fact that the damage to the community is probably going to generate some kind of an assessment over and above the reserves that the community has for maintaining their premises. So understand that the buyer needs to be aware. That's why we came out with the Hurricane Ian disclosure, that your buyer needs to be aware that these assessments can drag out. They have to wait for the insurance claim to be settled, and then for that to be digested, and then for the association to say, okay, we asked them for 100, they gave us 70, and we've spent 100, or planning to spend 100. We got to get the $30 from the, or the 30 from the owners. And so that's going to be a sticky wicket, and one that the more you can do research on the community and what happened to the community during the storm, the better you're serving your customer and not serving them up surprises. The last paragraph, the last part of this paragraph is another kind of compliance issue, in that the seller, even though it's a pending special obligation, it's not determined as to the date and the amount on the effective date. The seller still has an obligation, if they're aware of it, from the meeting minutes, from publications from the association. If they're aware of it, then they must disclose it to the buyer, not necessarily that the amount, but that the fact is that there's going to be an assessment for the hurricane or whatever. And that turns out to be more than 1% of the purchase price. The seller can terminate the contract, or excuse me, the buyer can terminate unless the seller says, I'll pay everything over 1%. So it's a trap for the seller who doesn't pay much attention to rental property, or family member living there. If they don't pay much attention, and then all of a sudden there's a fairly large special assessment coming along that they didn't disclose to the buyer. The buyer's saying, well, wait a minute, hold it, you got to pay everything over 1%. And can that be a problem? Generally not. But it is an obligation of the seller to disclose what they know. Leases, you can kind of go into almost every paragraph of this contract and find some compliance discussions. But if there's Airbnb or HomeAway or a online rental service involved in these leases that are being passed on to the buyer, you need really an attorney to figure all this out. Because I'm selling to Mark, but I can't give Mark my VRBO account. All the monies that are in that account and all of the rentals that are booked on that account are going to come back to me, including any damage assessments, including any security deposits. All that's going to come to me. Mark's going to have to establish his own account at closing, and then new rentals and new deposits and new end of lease negotiations become his. But if there's already leases on the books from my ownership, they don't automatically transfer to Mark. So you really need an attorney to say, okay, here's the net of all of these leases that will be transferred to Mark under, at certain points in time. And that's money that I, the seller, have to give to Mark, but only when it comes in my account, and only the net. So it can get very complicated. A lot of people do the overnight and short-term rentals, and they do them very successfully. And if you're buying the property with the intent of continuing that income stream, then you need to make sure that it's properly documented. What a nice comment in the chat. Another leased item can be like a water softener or a water conditioning system, reverse osmosis system, where it's leased. Very good. So let's see where we are, we're 252. So inspections are really their own compliance area. But please don't participate in a discussion with your buyer that waives the inspections. We can talk about a lot of reasons why, but even if they want to make their contract stronger, they can say, hey, I want to inspect, but I don't, I'm not going to ask for repairs, especially in an as-is contract. I want the right to inspect, but I don't want to ask for repairs. Okay, that's telling the seller that you need to inspect, but you don't intend to ask for repairs. In the normal contract, the buyer really always wants to inspect because they have the inherent right in the contract to say, this is defective, you need to fix it. And if the seller says, no, I'm not, then the buyer has an open door to get their deposit back and move on. So the right to inspect and the inherent right to ask for repairs and make sure that the seller addresses defective items is really one of the major benefits to the buyer in this contract. So if they say to you, well, I'm going to waive inspections, I want my contract to look better, we have a waiver that we want them to sign, waiving any liability to us, and understanding that when the buyer waives inspections, they don't have a right to go into the house until the day before closing or the day of closing. They say, well, I want to go back and measure for drapes. I want to know. Seller can say, I'll be glad to let you in the day before or the day of closing. Until then, you don't have any right in the under the contract. So please don't waive inspections. That's a huge compliance problem. And invariably, the calls that I get are from buyers who say there was a leak in the air conditioning system and they just had it serviced and now I got mold and it took a long time to find the leak. And what can I do? Well, yeah, you certainly probably have some rights. What did your inspection say? Oh, I didn't inspect. It wouldn't have made any difference. No, the seller's maintenance obligation says that Mark has to maintain the property in the condition it's in at the time that I can inspect for. So if I inspect the air conditioner at closing and it's not working properly, but it was working fine when we bought the place, and Mark has to spend the money or escrow the money to bring that up to speed. So in this particular case, had the seller, who was a contractor and knew all about construction, didn't inspect, and then when he got in there, he realized that there's a leak and there's mold. Was there a leak and mold when he bought the property? They don't think so. So anyhow, just a few things to hopefully make your day and your performance more reliable and more compliant. So it's 2:55. Is there anybody that has any questions or discussion? Did you get some value out of today from broker Jeff flapping his gums for an hour?
Jeff, I enjoy them all. They're always good. I always get something out of there. And plus just the reinforcement, because I can't remember all this stuff. So I think it's great that we do this even sometimes as a review, because I certainly need it. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. Mark, thanks for joining us today. Your insight is always great and very much approved. And so I'm signing off. You guys have a good afternoon. Christina, you too.
Thanks, Jeff.